we're working on the image as a kind of category. What is the categorical power of the image? And Chora, this notion, this Platonic notion of space, really gives a good suggestion, gives a clue as to what the relationship is between literacy and electracy. Because in classical Greek metaphysics, the idea was that being and becoming came together in Chora, this space, this receptacle that held these two together and allowed them to interact. It was it's the image of media. The medium, Chora, is the site of medium. And then Aristotle refined Plato's ideas and set aside Chora and preferred the word topos, place, as a much more confined and an empty area that things moved in and out of. So it's the idea of an abstract, empty container of space. And then this notion of physical space passed into rhetorical and logical space. And we got the idea of topoi, or the topos, as a kind of a category, a gathering up of similar things into a unit, into coherence. And a person could, like the common places, these would be the topoi in argument. You knew they worked every time. Like a politician has a topos of how do you show yourself to be a sensitive, loving person, and you kiss a baby, and that would be a kind of a topos. And you would know that would work every time. It didn't matter which baby. It's an abstract category. Just kiss a baby, and you're golden. That would be an example. In the Greek notions of space, the relationship between topos and chora was the relationship between place and space. So you would have a number of topoi that would be in a chora. It'd be like you'd have a number of places that would be in a space or in a region. So chora would be like region in this sense. Well, we transferred that in chorography to thinking about, in its logical and rhetorical sense, that chora doesn't replace topos. It's not like, all right, we're going to have a new rhetoric, we're going to have a new inventio in our rhetoric or our logic, but rather we're going to, we now understand how literacy or the logic of literacy can fit into the logic of electracy. It's kind of the way topoi fit into a region or into a chora. And the way this worked, and so that the chora brings these topoi into relationship and cuts across them, shows really a different kind of relationship than they have themselves. What we did, the way we applied this or tested this in the Miami zone was we were examining the topoi that were creating the atmosphere of Miami before we ever got there. I mean, part of our mission was of the Teoria was to take the attunement of the river zone. Well, before we went in there, we wanted to know, well, what is the attunement? What is the understood, the commonplace attunement of the zone already? How is Miami? What is the atmosphere of Miami as an imaginative place? Where is it already? And of course, it's already been coded. It's pre-coded by several discourses, especially the discourse of advertising. The advertising image of Miami is really, I suppose, similar to perhaps the atmosphere created in any kind of advertising, but especially some of the campaigns that we were looking at were based on a kind of feeling of nostalgia. That you remember the vacations of your youth, the time your family went to Florida when you were a kid, and playing in the sand and finding the seashells and all of that. What fun that was. Do that, recover that experience today. There's kind of a nostalgia for a better time, a simpler time, and that kind of advertising feeling was there. So we already had this advertising topos, or the topos of promotion. This is this magical place, this wonderful environment. Well, another topos that was informing the Miami zone was that of Miami Vice and neo-noir and hard-boiled detective stories. This is one of the most common images associated with the city of Miami, and creates the atmosphere of that city. So right up against or interconnected with the promotional tourist kind of nostalgia was this neo-noir feeling, and what most analyses of noir, hard-boiled detective stories talk about is that it's a kind of nihilism, because the protagonist in a hard-boiled story might himself or herself, but particularly himself, would be a virtuous person, right? This would be a person who had courage, a sense of duty, a sense of loyalty to friends, but this would be in a kind of isolated way or a kind of alienated way. And the world in which this detective worked would not be the world of a Sherlock Holmes. It would not be the world that made a lot of sense in a rational way, that the detective could just reason in this ratiocinative kind of Holmes story, reason through the situation, but rather the hard-boiled protagonist is a person of action who's often wrong in terms of when they try to figure out what's going on. They're often wrong. The world really doesn't make any sense. The world collectively is broken down in terms of its values, in terms of its sense of order, and the detective just makes what personal room for himself as he can in that world. This atmosphere is an atmosphere of nihilism. This is what the commentators say. So we thought, well, when we go into Miami, we have to understand that not only is there's really three, or we put it this way, there's really three moods that are already, three topoi that are already organizing the mood of Miami. And of course, so there's the nihilism of Miami Vice, there's the nostalgia of the promotional advertisements, and then there's a third mood, which is that of the consultants, the empirical consultants who are already there, and that's the mood of instrumental reason. It's like they look at Miami and say, here's a problem, and we can solve it. You know, they've got a kind of calculative sense of everything can be understood, everything can be figured out, everything can be solved. You know, we'll improve it in this way, and here's what you should do. So that's another kind of mood. So we thought, well, now we'll go as Terraria. We'll go into that space, and we will find an attunement that figures out how all these three go together. Well, at first, so this was the idea of Chora, was discovering the region, discovering the atmosphere of how all the topoi interacted in the region. And at first he thought, well, of course, and the Terraria will be objective, or it'll be neutral. It won't already have it made up its mind about what the mood should be or anything, but rather it'll just find out what it is, take the attunement of the zone. Well, it didn't turn out to be that way at all, because as we then looked into what we were doing a little more fully and took into account our own position, we came to realize, and we became educated to the fact that the Terraria, of course, is a very ancient institution, actually already has a topos of its own. It's a topos of wisdom. Wisdom already has its own state of mind. It's not nihilistic, it's not nostalgic, but precisely the state of mind has its own name, and that name is ataraxy. This is what the ancients called it, the Stoics, the Epicureans. Basically, the state of mind was figured always in the image of a shipwreck, a spectator watching a shipwreck from the shore, witnessing a scene of disaster. Specifically a shipwreck because, of course, in the pre-industrial world, I mean, the shipwreck was the most one of the most spectacular kinds of disasters, certainly one that affected almost everybody who wanted to travel anywhere in the world had to go on a ship. And what the philosophers or the wisdom discourse said about the shipwreck was that the attitude of the spectator watching the shipwreck was that a lesson about happiness. What does it take? What is the world like? I mean, this is really what the attunement of an image does, is when we're attuning the image, when we're assessing the atmosphere, we're really assessing our own state of mind, or the state of mind of the world that we're in. How do we feel about disaster? How do we feel about problems? Not so much just how do we feel in some objective sense, but really what is the world like in which such things can happen? And what the wisdom tradition said was that the conclusion that was drawn was that there's nothing that we can do about that shipwreck. That shipwreck is going to happen with us or without us. We can't change the world. We can't improve the world. This whole idea of progress is, not there. But rather, what we have some control over is our own state of mind, our own desires. We can control that. We can't control the world. So what we do is we withdraw from the world, and this was the advice of wisdom. This was the mood of wisdom, is we withdraw from the world, we reduce our own desires, and we find happiness in this feeling of invulnerability, this feeling of not caring. this feeling of realizing there's nothing that we can do, and the source of happiness is in our own contentment with the state as it is. So we discovered that the Teoria already had this mood. We were already inside a topos ourselves. It wasn't as though we had no topos, but rather we were approaching the topoi of the other discourses in terms of our own topos. And we had to take that into account, that would be part of what we came to experience when we did the attunement of the zone. So when we're talking about topoi, in a sense now we're really talking about a scene which is already, the scene is not empty, but the scene is already, as a Chora, fully occupied by a whole range of discourses, which are interacting, which are in conflict. And another way to look at it is we could say we're looking at a scene which is already full of stereotypes, or we could say it's already full of dead metaphors, if we're looking at it from the point of view of language. Any zone that you look at is going to be full of these already existing moods which are in conflict with one another. These already existing structures. So that means that when you're doing an attunement, when you're looking at a place, whether it's the Miami River or whether it's the Niagara Falls area, you're going to be looking for these dead metaphors. You're going to be looking for these cultural corpses that are lying around there, ready to be revived, though. I mean, this is what we know from the poets. The lesson of art, the lesson of poetry, is that some of the most powerful images have come from the reactivation, the reanimation of the dead metaphors that are there in the language or that are there in the cultural codes. So part of the way of doing an attunement, say whether that's a student visiting the website or whether that's an investigator, a consultant touring a problem zone, is to look at that zone in terms of the scene of recognition. Which situation do I identify with? Which situation do I recognize as being the external equivalent that shows me the correspondence of my own emotion, my own condition, and my own problem? That's the answer to my own burning question. So if you're looking at Niagara, for example, you might go there and you say, let me see now, what is the scene that I most identify with here? And you look at the stereotypes of Niagara Falls, say, and it might be the honeymoon motel, that tacky motel with the heart-shaped bed, in the red towels or something. Do I see the sort of tackiness of that, the kind of hopelessness of that? Is that what I experience? Or what about that daredevil who's going to go over the falls in a barrel to prove something, to get some kind of attention? How desperate is that? Is that how desperate I am? Or is that what's happening to me? I'm going along in my life, but there's a huge falls ahead, and I'm in a barrel. How good a barrel is it? Is it a steel reinforced padded barrel? Is it a barrel of wooden staves barely held together by a rusty iron hoop? Or what kind of, does it have wings? Am I in a cartoon? But the point is that the scene already has all these stories in it, and then as one drifts through the zone, the question is to be sensitive to these topoi that already exist, and be attuned to their moods and discover the one that you recognize. And then as a kind of a poetic experience happens, as the insight is charged, the metaphor is reanimated, and the scene comes alive again because it's been made personal as a kind of expression, psychogeography in which your inner and outer worlds are brought into a meaningful coherence.